Coming towards the end of the 8th chapter of the Shmone Prakim of the Rambam. Now, in this section, the Rambam introduces a number of ideas. As far as I can tell, there are shades of difference between them, and I will try to pull them apart and state them clearly, independently, and show how they work in the context of the problem that he's raising. He discusses this again in the Mishnah Torah and somewhat in the Nevuchim, so it's something which he worked on a lot over time. We're studying this, and I'm not going to do everything else, but this is what he says. But it remains for us to explain a certain topic, that there are some verses that make it appear that God decrees on man either he decrees rebellion. And that, if God decrees rebellion, that would force him to rebel. And that would contradict the Rambam's stress on free will. And he says this is not correct. And therefore, I will explain to you this matter by looking at the various verses that appear to people that way. One of them is the famous, what's called Bris Ben Basarim, where HaKadosh Baruch Hu tells Avraham Avinu that his descendants will be strangers in a land that doesn't belong to them. And it says, Va'avadum ve'inu osam. That is to say, your descendants will serve them, the owners of the land, and they, the owners of the land, will afflict your descendants. So, the critics look at those words, and they say, clearly the words say that HaKadosh Baruch Hu decreed on the Egyptians that they should do evil to Abraham's descendants. And if HaKadosh Baruch Hu decreed that they should do this evil to Abraham's descendants, why then did HaKadosh Baruch Hu punish them? The Rambam said very clearly that if our actions were not our own free choice, then it would be unjust to punish us for the things that we do against commands, since we have no ability to obey or disobey the commands on our own. Whatever we do would be decreed from heaven. So he says, we're talking about the Rambam's discussion of free will, and the problem that he's facing now is that there are verses that seem to say that HaKadosh Baruch Hu takes away free will. In particular, the verse says that Abraham is told by God that Abraham's descendants will be tortured, punished, afflicted, and those who cause the affliction will be punished for it. And if God is decreeing that these people should torture and afflict the Jews, then they presumably don't have free will. And if they don't have free will, then why are they being punished? So he says, this statement that he told Abraham is a statement that's completely general. It's like someone says, in the future, there will be a generation, and some of them will be righteous, and some of them will be wicked. When someone says, in the future generation, some will be righteous, some will be wicked, he's not decreeing that Reuven should commit murder, or that Shimon is going to give charity. That's not what he's doing. He's saying there will be some good people and some bad people. No one is going to claim, if he knew this as part of history, oh, so when I killed someone and took his wallet and invested in AT&T, God forced me to do it. Because God said, in this generation, some people will be wicked and some people will be righteous. Because nothing in the statement that was made picks out any individual. And when this person decided to be righteous, that person decided to be wicked, it was only his particular decision which put him into one class or the other class. And had he chosen differently, he could have put himself into the opposite class. Because the statement that was made was not made on any individual. And therefore you can't say that it's like a decree on that individual. No, a statement was made about the general group. And everybody's free will was left in place as it was before. Now, let's try to build this into a kind of court case. So, an Egyptian lives his life, and then after he dies, his soul is brought up before the heavenly court, and you oppress Jews. So, the Egyptian says, excuse me, but you yourself wrote a few hundred years ago that there are going to be oppressors and the Jews are going to suffer. And I'm one of them. So, it's not my fault. And God says to him, if you had not oppressed Jews, if you had chosen differently, would what I have said come true? How many oppressors were there in the Egyptian population? 14,000? So there would have been 13,999. I think that even if you had changed your mind, my statement would have been true. So why do you think that my statement accounts for your oppression? Why do you think that my statement gives you an excuse to release you from punishment from your oppression? Well, suppose the Egyptian says back to God, but suppose we had all chosen not to oppress Jews. Then what you said wouldn't have come true, would it? So suppose God says, yeah, quite right. If all of you had chosen differently, then what I said wouldn't have come true. But you didn't. You didn't. If water were wine, the world would be a very, very different place. But it isn't wine. I'm not punishing you because of, or in spite of, or in terms of what might have happened in some other universe. I'm punishing you in terms of what actually happened. I'll give you an analogy. 10 people are in jail, and the king says, I have an opportunity for the 10 of you. I want you to run a race. Anybody who doesn't get to the goal line in 5 minutes will be killed. And of those who get to the goal line, the first 4 will be saved. And the rest will be killed. Run. And let's see what happens is 3 make it to the goal line in 5 minutes and 7 don't. So the king says, too bad, you guys. You're over. And they say, it's not fair. It's not fair. Look at that. You consigned us to death. So he says to the first of the 7, consigned you to death? I said the first 4 who make it under 5 minutes. Only 3 made it under 5 minutes. You could have made it. And if you would have made it, you would have been saved. I didn't consign you to death. And he says it to each one of the 7. Each one of you could have made it. So they say back, but we couldn't all have made it. Yeah, that's right. You couldn't have all made it. But no one of you has any complaint on me because you could have made it. Every one of you was capable of running it. You were just lazy. But if we had all made it, you would have killed us unjustly. Yeah, I would have, but that's not what happened. So, in terms of a decision of justice, when a person is being accused of a crime and he's in defense of himself in the crime, and the question is how the court will apply the law, the question there is, given the facts in the real world, does the law apply in a reasonable way? And the question of, if the world had been entirely different and you were applying that law, then something would have gone wrong, that may be correct, but that's not a defense for the person in the real world. So I think that's one way to explain what the Rambam is saying here. That his statement comes out right because there were so many thousands of oppressors, and each oppressor could have changed his mind. Nothing was stopping him from changing his mind. So that's one point that the Rambam is making here. I think is correct. Another thing that he says is that there's a difference between saying I decreed something to happen versus I'm just describing something that will happen. Even if there were a decree, if the decree were not labeled with a particular person's name, the previous argument I made would have gone through. But he does, part of what he says is that it's only a description. Now let's see. Suppose God says as a factor what's going to happen in the future, that certain people are going to do certain things. Does it follow that in order to guarantee these things will happen, God has to take away free will?
No.
Let me give you an example of how God can guarantee an outcome without taking away anyone's free will. George tells me he's on his way to the ice cream store. Now, I happen to know that George's preferences in ice cream are vanilla, chocolate, and strawberry in that order. I don't want George to buy vanilla. I have my reasons. So one thing I could do is follow him on the way to the store. When he gets out of the car and walks into the store, I pull out my revolver and put it in the back of his head. I say, George, no vanilla. And he considers his options and he gnashes his teeth and buys something else. Okay, I'm really interfering with his free will there, no question about it. Right? I'm threatening him with death. But suppose, on the contrary, my strategy is this. He gets into his car to go to the ice cream store, and I get into my helicopter to go to the ice cream store. I get there first, and I say to the vendor, how many quarts of vanilla ice cream do you have in your store? There's 132. I said, I want all of them. All of them. Pack them into my helicopter. And he does, and I fly off, and George comes walking in and says, give me 2 quarts of vanilla. And the proprietor says, I don't know, some nut just got here, and he poured up 132 quarts of vanilla. But I have chocolate and strawberry. Which will you have? And he says, I really wanted vanilla. But if it's chocolate and strawberry, I'll take chocolate. Is he exercising free will?
Yeah.
Of course he is. He has 2 choices, and he chooses the one that he wants. So I can guarantee that he will make a free choice if I know his preferences, if I know what he will choose under certain circumstances, and you often know that about a person. So we're talking about God knowing now. Given the character that the people have, which is a result of their own choices and their own preferences and their own behaviors and their own patterns, and God says, I'm going to arrange oppression for the Jews by setting up circumstances where a certain percentage of Egyptians, I knowing their preferences, will choose to oppress Jews freely. That's another way in which God can arrange that an outcome take place without interfering with anybody's free will. So there are at least 2 different ways you can explain how the setup is done in such a way that God predicts that there will be people who will perpetrate evil and will be punished for it, and they will do so with free will, and there will be no injustice in the circumstances. Are we together so far? Okay, now the Rambam addresses a harder case, famous case. He says, this answer that I gave you, I'm sorry, he introduces a different one here. By the way, this is a statement about what non-Jews will do with their free will and they're being punished. And he has a parallel statement about what will happen when Jews will use their free will, which says, before Moses dies, God says to Moses, behold, you're going to be gathered to your ancestors, and this nation will arise and will go after the false gods of the land. So here, and then it says how they're going to be punished. So here the Rambam introduces a third idea, and that is that when the Torah describes punishment, this is extremely, extremely crucial. When the Torah describes punishment, it is never a prediction. Listen carefully. It's never a prediction. It's always a warning. There's no commitment that punishments will have to come true. So if there's a statement that God will punish so-and-so individual or group or the nation in certain ways and it doesn't come true, that is not a problem. Because God could always be merciful. God could change it to a different time and place. God could take it out in a different form. The statements of punishment are always conditional. So that being the case, it's not even a prediction that it's going to happen. You could say, well, God predicted, and therefore it was not their fault, and they have an excuse because it was only a warning. That's that. Was your hand up? No. Okay. Now, oh yes, ma'am.
It does, but in these situations in which the narrowing of people's options in their free will, they, as we said, they still have options, but given the narrowing of the situations and considering, so it turns out that somehow it's going to happen that a lot of people will still choose the wrong.
That's right. It certainly will. And by the way, I was just discussing this with my Rebbe, and we were going through some of the sources about it. There's a famous Gemara that the golden calf, which we had in last week's Parsha, on the one hand, King David, where he sinned with Bathsheba, the Gemara says that they were not ra'ui, they weren't in a condition of performing those transgressions, but God put them in a position of performing those transgressions, I'm choosing my words carefully, so as to teach tshuva, the fact that you can repair transgressions. The Jewish people with the golden calf teaches that the people as a whole, if it fails, can do tshuva. And King David teaches that an individual can do tshuva. So the naive reader says, aha, look at that. God caused them to sin so as to teach tshuva. But that's nonsensical. If God caused them to sin, they didn't do it with their own free will. If they didn't do it with their own free will, there's no tshuva. Tshuva is only for something which you decided with your own free will. That's agreed upon by all the commentators. If you didn't have any capability of acting otherwise, you're called onus. And for onus, you don't do tshuva. You do tshuva, like the Rambam says in Hilchos Tshuva, for mazid, where I knew very well what I was doing, I knew it was wrong, and I chose to do it anyway. Or shogig, where I was negligent, I didn't know, but I should have known better, and I could have known better, and I was lazy and didn't investigate the information. There has to be some real guilt. So it's simply not correct. So the one way to explain what happened with the golden calf on the one hand and Bathsheba on the other hand is this. When a person works through life, often, and many sources describe this, though there are sources that describe other things as well, they describe that when you work through life, your challenges change. you don't remain subject to all the same challenges. And whereas 11-year-olds or 14-year-olds often steal, and it's a terrible challenge for them, and at a certain point they know it's wrong, and still they've been in a habit and they have the temptation. By the time they're 23, they don't steal anymore. And they don't have a temptation to steal anymore. It's just not part of their makeup to steal anymore. So your challenges change. For the 23-year-old, it might be envy, or it might be speaking Lashon Hara, or it might be cheating on an exam, or it might be other things at different ages. Now you take the person when he's 45, stealing from the candy store. I mean, like, forget it. Can't even remember when he was 14 that he did that. Now imagine he had a sudden urge to steal from the candy store. What's the matter with me? It's absolutely crazy. What? I have that urge? So one way to explain it is the Jewish people, after receiving the Torah at Sinai, were beyond a temptation to make a molten image and to use it in certain ways. And King David was beyond being tempted by the beauty of a woman, because Baruch Hu artificially restored that Yetzer Hara, which they had outgrown, outmatured, and had cast behind them. He artificially restored it to them so that their free will was restored. Now, he did that knowing, as I said 17 minutes ago, knowing that when that free will was restored, they would fail. That doesn't mean he forced them to fail. It means he put them in a position where they could exercise free will, and then they failed freely. So that's another way in which God can arrange it that a person perform a transgression without taking away his free will. And that is what's coming up in the next paragraph, at least. Well, we'll have the Rambam and then the Ramban. Yeah?
And so what is the nature of King David's free will before the incident?
So, I'll give you an example. I was brought up in a non-reformed background, and I remember when I was first becoming religious, one of the daily difficult challenges was mincha, especially in the winter, because the afternoon is very short. And I have a life, thank you. I'm not coasting. I'm doing things, and I'm busy, and I'm involved, and all of a sudden, sundown in 6 minutes. But I'm in the middle of a lecture. Can I walk out in the middle of a lecture? It's not nice. What do I do now? So it can be challenging circumstances. Or to be late for things, or to cut off a telephone call all of a sudden, And the answer to the question is, I'll call you back in a half hour. And it was difficult. My children grew up not to have a mincha. What? What are you talking about? I don't know what you mean. It's mincha time. You daven. So I'm in the street. So I walk over the side of the street and stand in front of a wall and daven. It's not a question of choice for them, because they grew up that way. The whole class did it every day. They were always doing, when they were on hikes, they always stopped to daven mincha. It's just like in their blood. How about paying attention to every word? That's another matter. Controlling your mind, the mind shouldn't drift, and so forth and so on. That for them is a great challenge, and it's a challenge for many adults, for the rest of their lives. So they have free will, and they have free will challenges. They're not the same challenges. So King David was beyond, in terms of normal human moral development, was beyond that kind of temptation. The Jewish people were also beyond this kind of temptation, because Baruch Hu artificially restored the temptation. He took their psychology back to an earlier stage. And then, with his knowledge of what they will do, he knew that they would fail, and therefore he made it possible for them, but not that he caused them to do it. Okay? It's clear now?
Yeah.
Okay, so now we have a similar thing coming up in the next paragraph. The next paragraph is, at least on surface, Rambam deals with a slightly harder case, and that is, God says, I will harden Pharaoh's heart. Moses comes to Pharaoh and says, let my people go. And at a certain point, according to the text, it's the 6th, 7th, and 9th plagues, where it says, and also after the 10th plague, God hardened Pharaoh's heart to make them chase after the Jewish people. And some say the 8th was included as well. The first 5, it doesn't say it. And there, Rambam says, I can't squeeze out of that by saying it's only a prediction, or it wasn't somebody's named in particular, is named in particular, and God says, I will harden his heart. So there, it seems clear, according to the Rambam, that HaKadosh Baruch Hu took away his free will. So now there's no way of avoiding that. And the question is, how do you justify it? You see how systematic the Rambam is, right? There's no fooling around here. Okay. And afterwards he got punished. And here, I'll explain, but pay attention carefully and pay attention to what I say, and I'll explain to you what this means. Because Pharaoh and his advisors and army, if the only transgressions they had done were the transgressions where it says that God hardened his heart, if that were their only fault, then I would agree to you that there's a problem. It would mean God caused them to sin and punished him for the sin, and that would be really unjust. But that's not the case, because before the last 5 plagues, already 5 times Moses came to Pharaoh and pleaded with him to have Pharaoh release the Jews, and he refused to do so of his own free will. There, God didn't harden his heart. It's quite clear in the text that he hardened his own heart. Not to mention all of the punishments that Pharaoh and the Egyptians visited upon the Jews before the plague started. So, the lesson that's being taught here is this, that a person can, of his own free will, put himself in a position where he doesn't deserve free will anymore. He doesn't have the right or the privilege for free will anymore. And I would put this in the following dramatic terms. Imagine that after the first 5 plagues, and after 5 times, God says tells Moses, go to Pharaoh and tell him to let the Jews go, and he and the rest of them freely refuse to let them go. God says, okay, Pharaoh, die. That's my punishment for you. Would anybody have had any complaints? Unfair, forced, no free will. On the contrary, the whole thing was free will. The guilt is gigantic. They were drowning the newborn Egyptian Jewish babies. That's not guilt enough? We would have had no complaints whatsoever. So, God says, in terms of justice, Pharaoh's life is over. But, God says, I have something that I want him for. I want him to be used in a demonstration. He's my clay anyway. He's earned a punishment. My use of him is to show that a person can, through the use of his free will, lose the right and the privilege of free will, and therefore his life can become a mere means for the sake of other projects. And he can be punished for it. You say, all right, wait a second. I hear that he could lose his right to live. I could hear that who says the Creator has to cause him to die, could use him for other purposes, but would it be right also to punish him for those particular actions that he performed when he didn't have free will anymore? Okay, now here's an exercise in your imagination. This structure that I have just now described to you 3 times is a very familiar structure from everyday life. It's a very familiar structure where a person uses his free will, and he uses it in such a way that because of the way he used his free will, he loses his free will. And then when he's lost his free will, he does things which he's not freely choosing, and he's punished for them. When does that happen? You all know the answer.
Like smoking, like intoxication, inebriation, drink.
How about drunkenness? Smoking in a certain way, but how about getting drunk? But I didn't choose to run him over. I was blind drunk. I didn't see him. Is that an excuse? We say because you didn't choose to kill him, you're not going to be punished for it? Oh, you'll be punished for it, all right. Because you chose to get drunk. You didn't have to get drunk. So in this country, there used to be a very bitter advertisement on radio. You're going out with your friends, remember to give your keys to your friend. Because for sure you're going to get drunk. And don't drive home drunk. Give your keys to your friend. I thought to myself, that's where we're up to. That's where we're up to. Of course you're going to go out. Of course you're going to get drunk. Just don't be stupid and drive your car home. Nothing higher to hope for. You know? Okay, so it means that by using your free will wrongly, you can cause yourself to lose your free will and be responsible for what you do when you don't have the free will. This is what the Rambam is describing here, that Pharaoh did, that HaKadosh Baruch Hu did with Pharaoh. You used it for that period of time, you lose it, you don't deserve to have it, and I manipulate you, and you're punished for that. You're punished for that also, because your prior freely chosen wickedness deserves it. Yes?
Would that work in the opposite direction as well? That if you exercise your free will in the positive sense, that you get to a point where you're rewarded for doing things that you don't even realize that you're doing necessarily, like smiling at someone, that it might be.
Very well done. Exactly right. Rav Dessler talks about this. It works on the positive side as well. You train yourself to do the right thing, and then you come to do them automatically, and especially if the training was hard, if you had to overcome considerable resistance in inculcating the good habit, you get credit every time the habit works, for every good action that takes place. The analogy that I usually give to this is the following. Maybe this will help also. What they use, General Electric. They build a new power plant in your area, and they supply electricity, and they up the charge of the electricity. So clever George does a calculation after 6 years, and he writes to General Electric, I understand you built a new plant, and you invested in it, and you raised our salary, our expense, but I've calculated your profit from the greater expense, and you have now earned profit plus, earn back your investment plus 24% profit, and now I think from now on you should give us electricity free. You think General Electric will thank you for pointing it out and reduce the prices? I don't think so. General Electric's attitude is, we're producing electricity, right? You're heating your home, right? Pay. You're getting a product, pay for the product. We're not in business to make money off our investments. We're in business to make money. We sell a product. You don't like it? Don't buy our product. Get a generator or burn wood. We're not forcing you. So here, if General Electric building the power station is like you inculcating in the habit. You made the habit. Now the habit is running. Somebody says, well, you put in so and so many hours of struggle and effort for it, that deserves such and such a compensation. But the fact that it keeps running, no, it keeps running because you made it. And if it keeps running, it keeps generating merit for you. Absolutely. Absolutely. What you say is good on two levels. First of all, it's intuitively correct to compare the two. We also have a general principle that the Mida Tova, Merubah Pitas Operonius, when you have a principle which expresses liability and punishment, the corresponding principle of generosity and reward is at least as big as that, if not bigger. So you're quite right to take something where we have responsibility and loss and flip it over to the side of the right, of doing the right thing and being rewarded. It's 100% correct. Now, having read this in the Rambam many years ago and taught it hundreds of times, I happened to one day, maybe 20 or 30 years ago, look at the Ramban. And to my surprise, shock, and intellectual astonishment, the Ramban says the exact opposite of what the Rambam says. The exact opposite. I realized that if you don't read the commentaries, you can be taken in by your own simplicity or your own first responses. Ramban says the exact opposite took place. The first 5 or 6 plagues were so powerful, so devastating, that the plagues took away his free will. And when Moses comes to him after the 6th plague and says, let the people go, without any divine intervention, Pharaoh would have let them go without free will, just crushed by the plagues. So when it says, God says, I'm going to harden his heart, it means I'm going to harden his heart and stiffen his resolve to restore his free will, not to take away his free will. And in that way, he made all of his decisions with free will. Now I realized the words in the Torah that I'm going to harden his heart could be read either way. They could be read either way. I don't dictate which way it is. It's taking away free will or restoring free will. I don't know how many of you, this goes back to my ancient times, when I was a kid about 94 years ago. And, there was such a thing called television, which you can read about in history books. And the one thing they had was prize fights, boxing bouts. And you'd see the guy after the end of the 8th round, and he's really beat. He's really beat. He goes back to his corner with his trainer, and he's saying to the trainer, call it off, let it be a TKO, technical knockout. I gave up. And the trainer's job is to restore his courage to go out for another round. That's the job of the trainer. Or this happened in the Second World War. American soldiers went to Europe, and the first time they were fired on, 10% of them froze. Now, if you happen to be standing up and you freeze, that's not good because you're a good target for the Germans. They just pick you off. There were psychological officers assigned to the company to talk to them and prepare them and encourage them and to make sure they don't lose their free will by freezing. So this way, the Rambam's problem doesn't even arise. And it's equally consistent with the verses, and that being the case, you have another explanation for those verses which doesn't threaten the idea of free will. Okay, we got it? Okay, so now
Ask a question.
yeah, sure.
When Paro becomes king of Nineveh, how is that described now in the context of what he's done to the Jewish people, and now he later becomes a king?
I don't know. The Rambam often does not take into account midrashim of that type, and I don't know anywhere that he mentions that midrash. Often we have the understanding that the midrashim are not all consistent. They present contrasting perspectives on a certain set of events. So I don't know anywhere where the Rambam discusses it. So I'm just dealing with his. Yeah, and I guess I'll say one more thing because then the next thing is a new topic. The idea that a HaKadosh Baruch Hu took away Pharaoh's free will, according to the Rambam. So I explained the idea of using your free will in such a way that you don't deserve to have it anymore, and so forth and so on. But some people are still disturbed about this. Isn't the whole point of human existence free will? Isn't that what makes us different from squirrels and different from malachim, from angels, that we exercise free will, take responsibility for what we do? Wouldn't that mean essentially that you're contradicting the very nature of human existence and human importance and human significance? Wouldn't that be like a radical undermining of the very nature of the creation that took place? You hear what the Rambam said, okay, you can compare it to drunkenness and so forth and so on, but still it seems like something very radical and damaging to the nature of the creation is taking place. And I worked on that for quite a while, and I had a long, elaborate philosophical explanation. And then years later, I figured out there's not a question; it's foolishness to start with. I hope the original explanations didn't survive in the virtual sphere. Let's ask a simple question about all human life. How much of a commitment does God have to human free will? Quantitatively, how big is God's commitment to human free will? Isn't there a single fact of which everyone is aware that puts an absolute limit on each person's human free will? It's called death. No one's free will is going to be forever. Oh, so there's only going to be a finite amount of it anyhow. And then what about sleep? 30% of the time you're alive, you're sleeping, you're not exercising free will at all. God's commitment to man's free will is strictly limited. So then you say, why not complain about a person who goes into a coma? Contradicting the purpose of existence and so forth and so on. He's going to die and then he's not going to have any free will at all. So he goes into a coma 3 months before. So, given that God's commitment to free will is inherently limited, you can't draw the line and say, up to here, yes, but beyond that, no, because then it's not good anymore. So the same thing's true with hardening somebody's heart. Now, somebody says, well, then how do I know I have any free will at all? Maybe God's hardening my heart the whole time. So I think one thing that one ought to say about this is, maybe, but so what? If he isn't, you better do the right thing. So, the fact that it might be that he's controlling you and making you do everything that you do and you're really a robot, doesn't mean, therefore, I won't make any efforts. This doesn't follow in practical terms. Number one. Number two, the description the Rambam gives us here is only for colossal criminals. I hope you're not hiding something from me that really you're a terrific colossal criminal, and then you're comparing yourself with Pharaoh and saying, I don't know if I'm better than Pharaoh or worse. So maybe, I'm in Pharaoh's same class. Probably that's not a realistic thought for anybody in the room. I mean, I don't want to speak for you, but I would assume that, you don't have that worry. So that being the case, I don't think that it's a realistic worry. What's more realistic is that HaKadosh Baruch Hu gerrymanders our choices, and he sets up our alternatives for us, and alternatives are of different levels of difficulty. And what we have to trust is that the particular choices that we face are right for the abilities that we have and for the next steps in spirituality that we're supposed to take. The Gemara does say that if you undergo certain circumstances, you should worry that maybe your condition is so poor, your condition is so weak, that God has given up on you, and he's giving you your reward in this world, which would be a terrible, terrible fate. So I said, okay, Rabbi, so what's the criterion for that? And he says, well, here's one way to make sure that God has not given it up on you. If in a 30-day period, at least once, you put your hand in your pocket for a coin and pull out the wrong coin, he didn't give up on you. That's enough irritation to say that he cares about you, and you're still online, and what you do counts. Say, okay, Baruch Hashem, I've never yet had 30 days where that was my only irritation. I've had many more irritations than that. So, the normal conditions that we have, conditions that are described in all the stories of 1,000 pages of Tanakh, except for this one about Pharaoh's heart, and a couple of others which the Rambam brings, where the prophets say similar things. You hardened their hearts, and you turned their hearts against you, because, and that was speaking of Jews, because we, by our own choices, chose so badly that we didn't deserve to pull ourselves out of the disaster that we had created for ourselves. At any rate, that's the continuation. We have a few more days to finish this. Then I'm going to start a new section till the end of the Zman. I think we're going to talk about reasoning, elementary reasoning.
Thank you.
Yeah.